Good evening. My name is Carl Smallwood with Greater Columbus Community Trust, and I want to welcome you to this first in a series of virtual conversations. On December 4 at about noon, I was talking to some young men associated with something called Breaking Bread, Let's Talk, about talking across racial differences to understand each other and to build trust. At about that exact same time, Casey Goodson Jr. was shot and killed as he was entering his home. He was in the doorway of his own home, and he was shot and killed by a man with a badge and a gun. We're going to say Casey Goodson's name today. We're going to say his name. And if 2020 and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others has taught us anything, it's that Black and brown people are too often the victims of police violence. And in Columbus, Ohio today, a man is dead and a family is in pain. And we're here today because the killing of a young Black man by law enforcement under those circumstances demands an immediate, transparent, complete, thorough, and independent investigation, independent of the agencies involved. And it must be led by people who have one focus only, and that is to discover the truth. And if the truth is that this killing was not justified, then to seek justice for that criminal act. Now, we as individuals, organizations, and stakeholders in Columbus, members of Greater Columbus Community Trust, watched with some shock the events unfold after Casey Goodson Jr.'s death. And there was a lack of clarity about who would be involved in the investigation. And we welcome the FBI and the Department of Justice's intervention and arrival as part of the investigation. Because we believe that all of us, Casey Goodson Jr.'s family, the officer, and the Columbus community deserve justice. We have a right to justice. And we believe that to restore confidence in the process, it is necessary for local, state, and federal authorities to cooperate and to coordinate this investigation so that there is unquestioned confidence in the investigation that is being undertaken. We believe that to maintain confidence, it's important for local, state, and the local federal agencies to develop a plan and a procedure to ensure that if an event like this ever occurs again, God forbid, that there will be no stumble or delay or miscommunication about who will take the lead and who will cooperate. In some sense, that it be all hands on deck to assure the community that justice will be done. The silence of some voices and conflict of others has caused some in the community not to understand and to wonder about accountability and about justice. And so, we come here today in the aftermath of several days of protest. The protest in Columbus by the community to raise the name of Casey Goodson Jr. and to express the pain that the community is feeling. And the protest was powerful and it was peaceful. And we're thankful for that. But given the events of 2020, there needs to be more than protest. There needs to be policy. There needs to be communication across all of the lines: law enforcement, government, business, the community, faith leaders. All of us have a role in ensuring accountability and ensuring justice in our community. And so today we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to respond to the community trauma and grief. And Marion Stuckey and Ariana Gallagher are here today to address that issue for us. And we're going to welcome Henry Green's mother. We're going to say Henry Green's name. Henry Green was killed by police in 2016. And Adrienne Hood is his mother, and she will share with us today. And I've also asked Fred Benton, one of the leading criminal defense lawyers in the state, perhaps the country, to talk to us a little bit about investigations and procedure. And I've only given him 15 minutes, so he's only going to scratch the surface of that subject. But he may then be able to answer a couple of questions as well, because I know there are questions in the community. And so I've asked Steve Francis, who's also part of Greater Columbus Community Trust, to talk a little bit about the history and about that group of people, that group of stakeholders, because I believe the most troubling issues in our community will require all of us and each of us to listen to each other, to work together, to respond to each other. And if an event ever occurs again that challenges trust like the one that occurred on December 4, that we will respond to that challenge in a way that brings us together, not in a way that tears us apart. Steve, can you share a little bit of information about Greater Columbus Community Trust?
Be happy to do that, Carl. Thank you for your leadership. Columbus Community Trust is something that was founded around 2015. And in August of 2014, we all remember Michael Brown, hands up, don't shoot. It seems like 20 years ago since that occurred. But that was, those types of killings were, the onset of the formation of the Greater Columbus Community Trust and other similar organizations. Again, I want to thank Carl Smallwood for his leadership and Nancy Rogers at The Ohio State University and the Columbus Bar Association and John Mercer Langston Bar Association, the African-American focused bar association here in Columbus, for their leadership. These are a group of lawyers and dispute resolution specialists who wanted to get together and figure out how the community could be more resilient in its response to civil unrest and racial injustice and police violence on unarmed and otherwise peaceful folks. I told somebody that a Subway sandwich can be very deadly, but I doubt that the one that Mr. Goodson was carrying when he was tragically killed was going to do anybody any harm. In the diversity profession, the bias causes our mind to see weapons when they don't even exist. And we need to work harder. We need to redouble our efforts to train our law enforcement officers on those biases when they pop up. I am a lawyer and a diversity professional, and I was attracted to Columbus Community Trust because it does advocate for and really demand for a full, independent, thorough, and trustworthy investigation. And my good friend Fred Benton will lay out the framework of that type of investigation. When deaths like Mr. Goodson's occur, we demand these full, thorough, and trustworthy investigations, not because we're unjustified and entitled to it, but because the Columbus community deserves and has a right to justice when instances like these occur. The Columbus Community Trust also believes that in order to maintain confidence in city, state, and federal law enforcement and in those leaders at those levels, we want the community to trust the local government, the state government, the federal government, and those law enforcement officers that represent those institutions. We want to have confidence in them. But in order for that to happen, we must put in place clear procedures for independent investigations of any future police-involved shootings, violence, whatever results in the unjustified death of folks. You know, they say that there's two things for certain: death and taxes. Because of the rash of incidents, we need to modify that. The certainty seems to be the death of unarmed Black men and taxes. And that's the type of thing we need to address in earnest. What we aim to do at Greater Columbus Community Trust is to convene the community and the stakeholders that represent the community and their vast array of interests all up and down the spectrum. We want the community to be able to have a deep understanding of how law enforcement approaches these issues, and law enforcement to have a very deep understanding of what the community expects and anticipates when these instances occur. We want to build trust, and that's why we called ourselves Greater Columbus Community Trust. We want to build that trust among residents and between leaders, law enforcement, and the residents that they serve. We need to identify and develop processes that deal justly with constituency groups and their concerns. Carl mentioned the finger pointing, the who's on first, Abbott and Costello type of routine that we saw displayed during the Goodson investigation. The time for pointing fingers is not when you're standing over a dead body. And so we want to be able to identify a clear process that deals justly and swiftly and in full coordination with these issues, and not have finger pointing occur when there's been a tragic death. Columbus Community Trust wants to prepare the community to respond in resourceful and peaceful ways and in coordinated ways. We know that there's a lot of groups that have strong agendas and they have strong resources and purposes to address issues like this. We want to coordinate those efforts and be that sounding board, that convening sounding board that makes all voices heard and all minds clear. Particularly when there are events that challenge trust in the community, as the tragic death of Casey Goodson Jr. And finally, Columbus Community Trust seeks to develop and share plans, proactive plans for acting proactively in the midst of community unrest, similar to what we've seen. When we formed the Greater Columbus Community Trust, we knew that the Michael Brown killing was not going to be the last one. And unfortunately, we've seen a hit parade of tragic deaths since then all over the country and here in Columbus. And so we need to have more forums like these to make sure all voices are heard, to have those proactive plans, to build the trust, to reinforce resiliency. We also know that there are rogue groups that come in and riot to disrupt the otherwise peaceful protests that we try to conduct when instances like these occur. So we need to fetter that out as well. I know that it's a awesome program and we've got some great participants. So I want to get to the agenda. I'm going to introduce someone who needs no introduction, Kimberly Braswell. I've known her in the trenches and on the front line of diversity, equity, inclusion here in Central Ohio for many years. She's a trusted friend. She owns Chemistry, and that's her own consulting firm. She's going to navigate us through the program, and she will introduce the panelists that will be involved in discussing these issues tonight. Again, the anatomy of an investigation will be handled by attorney Fred Benton, a very well-known criminal attorney who's handled some very high-profile criminal cases here in Columbus and Franklin County. The explanation of trauma and grief by Marion Stuckey and Adriana Gallagher. Marion is with CARE Coalition, and Ariana is with STAR program. Next, we will have a testimonial, and we mentioned that Adrian Hood is here. the mother of Mr. Green that was tragically killed. She's going to give you a poignant testimonial that gives you a frontline perspective of how this impacts families and loved ones. We're going to have a dialogue with the panel, and that panel will be introduced later. We're going to have a Q&A session, and we're going to have a resource support, again, by Marion Stuckey and Adriana Gallagher. We'll have final thoughts from Reverend Burnett, a call to action by Kim Braswell, and close out with Carl Smallwood with some closing comments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kimberly Braswell, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Steve. So what I'd actually like for us to do first is, and again, remembering that where we are going to get some good information, and then where we're also going to figure out just as a community what's happening, and to try our best to use all of our unique gifts to align ourselves with justice. We also want to remember why we're here. So what I wanted us to do for those who are watching on YouTube, on Facebook, if you could join us in just taking a moment of silence to honor Casey, to honor Casey's life, instead of centering all of our heaviness on his death. Remember, this was a life, a beautiful life. So if we could just take a moment of silence for Casey's family, Casey's life, if we could do that really quickly. Not really quickly, but do it immediately right now. Take a moment of silence. Thank you, family. So I don't know about you, but on a very personal level, I woke up this morning and I was sitting with my daughters, and I am in a space of spiritual exhaustion without words about how to explain what's happening to people who look like their cousins, their father, their uncles, right? And one of the things that in the community we've been asking for is a fair and just investigation. And it dawned on me in some of the conversations we've been having in a lot of spaces where I'm fellowshipping with community that we don't all know exactly what that looks like. And so we thought, let's get some folks who understand these pieces and parts. Sometimes what outrages us is when we don't know how things operate. And there have been so many different ways when we think about systemic oppression, where there have been people who did and did not have access to systems and understanding how systems work, or even understanding how they're supposed to work. So what we wanted to do is start this conversation with an idea about like, okay, tell me then, if I don't understand, tell me how a criminal investigation works. And then let's get into how these things, whether they do or don't work according to how they're supposed to be structured, how then does this show up in families and in communities? So I'd like to bring into this space right now, Mr. Frederick Benson, to kind of talk with us a little bit about how this works. So thank you, Mr. Benson, for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. I wish that we were meeting for the first time under different kinds of conversations, but I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit more for you, helping to educate the community about how does this work? How do we begin understanding, so that when we're saying we want this to be just and we want this to be fair, what are the components that we're looking for so that we can be educated and informed voices in community? So I'm going to give you time and some space to kind of just share with us what we as citizens deserve to know.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be on this program. My condolences to the family of Casey Goodson, the family of Mr. Green, and to all of those who have lost loved ones at the hands of violence. I can't fathom what that experience would be like, but certainly my prayers and concerns are with you, and ask that God give you peace during this very trying time. In my background as a criminal defense lawyer, I've had the opportunity to be exposed to investigations at all levels, whether it be in terms of the municipal level, for misdemeanors, for felonies, federal offenses, and the like, even crimes that occur across the country. There are three key components to an investigation, and they all begin with the same premise. First of all, you begin with a preservation of the scene. Secondly, you begin with a preservation of the evidence. And then third, you begin with a preservation of witnesses. And the reason why that is so critical is that oftentimes an investigator, law enforcement, will have just one opportunity to be able to take control of a scene of a crime. Once that opportunity has passed, the ability to return is oftentimes limited, and certainly the scene may very well be compromised upon the officer's return. So when you go to, you see on the news, for example, and you see that yellow tape that surrounds a particular area, that's the area that the officers have defined to be a crime scene. You want to make sure that no one comes into that scene. You want to make sure that no one goes out of that area. You want to make sure that nothing is brought into that area. And you certainly want to make sure that nothing is taken out from that area. Now, you will see officers coming in and out of that crime scene, but as they're coming in and out, their presence, their interests, and their exits are being logged so that at all times, someone is conscious of who is there, and why they're there, and specifically what they're doing. With respect to preserving the evidence, again, when you come onto a scene, you don't know what happened in all of its detail. You don't know the significance of the items that you're looking at. So there's a tendency to be over-inclusive in the gathering of evidence. It may be that there's something that the officers will pick up as part of from the scene of the crime and catalog it as evidence, and later find out that it had absolutely nothing to do with the crime that occurred. Other times, there's that small thing that they may have debated whether do we collect this, do we not collect this, and you come to find out later on that that's probably one of the most significant articles of evidence in the investigation of the crime. Similarly, as you're gathering the evidence, you also are then cataloging that evidence. So you're taking photographs. You're taking the photographs of the evidence as it is and where it is. So no one has moved anything, no one has touched anything, no one has adjusted anything. That tells you, and there'll be a photo law, there'll be an evidence collection law, and what they'll tell you is the item that was recovered, where it was recovered, say was it in the living room, was it in a particular bedroom. They'll give the direction at which a photograph is taken. So is this photograph taken of the object from a northwest perspective, or is it taken from a southeast perspective? There's also the time in which the photograph is made, and as well as the time in which the evidence has been collected. Typically what happens is that you have a lead detective that is assigned to that scene, to that investigation, and it's their responsibility to make sure that all the appropriate steps are taken within the course of the investigation. They become the point person by which all the information is funneled to. So if there's a name of a potential witness, that lead detective gets that information. The cataloging and the collection of the evidence, those logs and that information, those summaries are provided to the lead detective. It is also the lead detective's responsibility to determine how that evidence is handled. For example, if a firearm is recovered from a scene, the lead detective will then give instructions for that firearm to be submitted to the crime lab for purposes of an analysis. If there's DNA evidence to be collected, then that detective will make sure that that evidence is properly collected, cataloged, and then submitted to a lab for analysis. There could be video cameras that are relevant to an investigation, particularly in this modern age. There's a canvas made of the neighborhood. There might be security cameras that capture some of the activities relating to the crime. There might be local establishments that have surveillance videos that are available to or made available to the police for purposes of an analysis. And also when we talk about the preservation of witnesses, typically what will happen is that there will be a canvassing made of the neighborhood. So uniformed officers or detectives will go knocking on doors and find out who heard what, see what bits of information that they might be able to glean from those interviews. Now, a lot of times it may turn out to be nothing, but then there are many times in which significant information is in fact gathered. But you don't have the opportunity for a second chance if the investigation is not done properly. Now, sometimes there are follow-ups where you're able to go back to a scene for this, that, and the other, but that's oftentimes extremely rare. That's why it is very important for that first step in terms of the preservation of the scene, preservation of the evidence, and the preservation of witnesses. That is a key component to a good investigation. When law enforcement respond to a scene, they may or may not have details that would give them information as to why what happened may have occurred. Oftentimes their response is predicated upon a 911 call. So you will investigate that call and determine what is being reported as it is unfolding. So someone might say, well, someone has just kicked in my back door, and then there are shots that are being fired. That gives the officers, when they arrive at the scene, an idea as to what to anticipate. But again, even though you may have a theory, even though you may have an idea as to what may have taken place, you still approach the investigation, in any investigation, with an open mind. Because oftentimes if you go in and you're thinking that you have a suspect, for example, you might be keying in on one individual who might in fact have absolutely nothing to do with the crime that has occurred. So again, you go in and with the thought that you follow the evidence where it leads you. You don't collect the evidence to fulfill a particular thought or to fulfill a particular theory. You let the evidence take you where it does. That's the sign of a good investigation. Now, again, I'm glossing over a lot of things right now, but the next step to that, or in concert with all of that, is that once you gather this evidence, then the question is, what do you do with it? Well, the evidence, again, there's an inventory log that's created. There's a property number assigned to each article of evidence that's collected. That property number follows the movement of that property from the scene up until the time that it's brought to trial and introduced into evidence. That property number is what's assigned when items are submitted to a laboratory for purposes of an analysis. So everything has a property number. Secondly, the lead detective will then submit information, say, for example, to the crime lab. In the case of a homicide, you have an autopsy that is created, that is performed. And then that creates a whole host of other items that become critical in purposes of this analysis. You have, again, DNA evidence that is submitted. Sometimes you may have information based upon descriptions that are provided to you by witnesses, and maybe even a potential name, that you then develop a photo array. And then you go back to those witnesses with a potential suspect in mind, and you have those witnesses take a look at the photo array and see whether or not the individual that they've described is within that array of photographs for purposes of identification. Sometimes there might be a gathering of DNA evidence, and that DNA evidence is submitted into what's known as CODIS, which is basically a database of DNA evidence that is collected primarily from individuals who have been arrested or otherwise incarcerated. So that DNA evidence is submitted into the CODIS data bank, and the officers are looking for whether or not there's a hit. In other words, a hit tells you that that the DNA evidence that was submitted, that you may have a potential match. That then helps the officers in terms of identifying a potential suspect. And then there's a follow-up that's done to actually locate that individual and to collect DNA evidence from them. Typically, it's an oral swab. And then that information is submitted again for purposes of an analysis to confirm whether or not there is a match or whether or not there is no match. In addition, you have situations where because of the nature of the crime, it's going to influence the scope of the investigation. Not all cases are evaluated at the same level, just by logic. It doesn't take as much to investigate, say, for example, a petty theft offense as it does a homicide. So you're not going to expect the same levels of investigation or investigative techniques to be employed for the lesser crime as you would for the greater crime. In addition to that, you also have circumstances in which, because of the nature of the crime, there is a delay sometimes in information that's being granted, that it takes. These investigations take time. You have to give law enforcement an opportunity to be able to collect all of the evidence before there's any particular conclusions or decisions that are made. That's the sign of a good investigation. I've been involved in cases in which investigations have taken place, and it's not until 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line before someone is finally arrested. That's the rarity. Most of the cases, the officers will have someone in mind fairly quickly, and then an arrest is made. Then, of course, the arrest itself becomes a part of the investigation. The officers are going to talk with the individual, advise them of their right, and see if that individual will be willing to talk with them, and hopefully in the process, hopefully from the standpoint of law enforcement, then make a confession. When you have situations that involve shootings by a law enforcement officer, that takes on a particular dynamic, because among other things, there are interviews that are made not only of the officer who committed the shooting, but also the other officers who were present at the scene or otherwise involved in the investigation. So they are interviewed just like any other witness. Oftentimes, these statements are recorded, as are statements of lay witnesses. There are recordings, both video as well as audio. So you're interviewing the officers. You are examining the firearm of the officer who fired the weapon. You're collecting any physical evidence relating to that. So you're looking for shell casings. You're looking for other ballistics evidence to see exactly how many shots were fired, whether or not the shots were fired at close range, or other circumstances that might have an impact in terms of an analysis of the particulars regarding that particular that given shooting. With other officers who are present, unless there's some question as to whether or not multiple shots were fired, or whether or not there's a question as to if any of the other officers may have discharged their weapons, oftentimes their weapons will also be seized, examined, and determine whether or not the ballistics that were the shell casings and other projectiles and other items that are recovered at the scene would match their firearm. So again, the thought is you're going to be over-inclusive, with the idea that it's better to have more than to have less. So those are the particular dynamics. Somewhere in the process, and sometimes it's at the very scene, sometimes it's later on in the investigation, you may have the prosecutor involved. And after the prosecutor's had an opportunity to review the evidence, the prosecutor may very well direct the officer, say, look, detective, I need more information. You collected this particular item. Have you submitted this particular item for an analysis? Now, it's important to note that not everything that's collected is necessarily analyzed, because, again, depending upon what it is and what the theory of the investigation might be, it may not necessarily be considered as being a valuable part of the investigation. But again, as to what items are submitted for laboratory analysis and what items are not, those are decisions that are made by the lead detective. They are the ones. So the laboratory doesn't come in and collect everything and do an analysis. It doesn't work that way. The lab only responds to the information that they have been provided. So if the detectives do not provide the laboratory the information, then the laboratory does not conduct that particular analysis. You have other elements of an investigation, particularly driven by the nature of our modern technology. Cell phones oftentimes come into play. So if they have access to a cell phone, those cell phones will be seized. There are search warrants that are engaged in to pursue an analysis of the cell phone. And actually, search warrants may be used in a whole host of other information, including the collection of DNA evidence. But you have you gather the data from the cell phone. They do what's called a dump, and then that allows them to see when that cell phone was used, how that cell phone was used, and then they look at area information to look at cell phone tower activity to provide location, times of calls, and things of that nature. It appears my time is up. I'm certainly open to any questions.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Benton. I didn't want to interrupt you because these are the things that I think people want to know about, and we're getting lots of questions that are populating in the chat. So what I wanted to do is ask you if we could just hold off, because I think some of the things you're addressing, that's where people are really curious to learn more, which is the whole point of why we wanted to do this conversation, right? Is because people need to know these ins and outs, these aspects, some of the things, and not that you need to address this yet, but just so that you know some of the things that are coming up. People are asking, do we feel that the Goodson case is being handled fairly? What is the timeline between how long things should take for things? These are some of the questions, and we're actually populating several of them, so we'll share those momentarily. But I just wanted to let you know, if we can, we're going to come back to you in the Q&A.
Sure.
For that. Thank you so much for sharing. So what I wanted to do right now, family, is we're going to bring Mr. Benton back in momentarily, but I want to remind us that there is this other element to it, right? There's the information portion, and then there's the human being portion, right? Where it's just like all of the things that Mr. Benton was talking about. We have families who never expected that they would have to deal with any of this, who are then thrust into legal processes. And I know I wanted to make sure that when we decided to convene this conversation, I needed on a personal level to make sure that we honored the space and thought about the families. And so I called my friend Adrian, because not only has Adrian on an informational level, she just did a phenomenal TED Talk about qualified immunity, but she knows this from a different perspective. And so I wanted to remind us all, for those of us who might be approaching this topic on many different levels, whether it's a action space, a belief space, a heart space, a thinking space, to remember that these are human beings that we're talking about, families that we're talking about, folks that belong to people, belong to communities, right? And so I wanted to create space for Adrian to just share your story, your belongingness to this topic. I wanted to create some space for you. Thank you so much, Adrian, for being here. I want to give you the stage, the platform right now. So come off mute and share your story.
Thank you so much, Kim. Trying to gather my thoughts after Mr. Benton's presentation, which I truly appreciate. All of the information that he was able to provide to the community. And under normal circumstances, all of the processes that an investigation would go through. Unfortunately, the experience of family members and our loved ones who are killed by the police, things seem to go a bit differently, and that's very unfortunate. So I'll start out with a little bit about myself and who I am. I am Adrian Hood, the mother of Henry Green, who was killed 4.5 years ago by Columbus plainclothes police officers in the Linden community. And when I got into this space, like you said earlier, it was definitely something that I never imagined myself or my family ever having to endure. But we have had to, and we continue to fight this fight. And I was trying to jot down some of the things that Mr. Benton had said, and then try and correlate those to the real experiences that we as the families have. And unfortunately, one of the first things that I wanted to address is for people to understand that language is important. The words that someone uses is important. The investigation into my son's death very early on, I mean, within the first couple of hours, which obviously an investigation could not be completed that fast. There was not an opportunity to speak to that many witnesses that soon, but it did not keep the police officer's spokesperson from being on the news and one calling my son a suspect. And to this day, they still haven't been able to tell me what my son was a suspect of. Um, and I noticed that in these police shootings, this is something that is continually done. The victim is deemed a suspect. Early on, speaking with the lead detective in my son's case, within the first couple of minutes of us sitting down and talking, he said to me, "I see your son was not a felon," as if that validated a reason for my son to be shot um, without his due process, if again he had done anything um, wrong. So I would like to say, again, that words are important. Um, and then also, unfortunately, I knew because of policies, because of the FOP contract, because of those things being in place, because our city, and even when they were found negligent by the Department of Justice, to be negligent as far as racial profiling and excessive force many years um, ago, the policies and the contract have continued to keep the flow of things as they have always been done in Columbus. So yes, policy needs to be addressed, but more importantly, it needs to be a lot of emphasis put on the individuals that we are actually hiring to represent our police department and ultimately represent our city. um, Another thing that Mr. Benton brought up that I would like to talk about is the experience that my family had as far as the grand jury process is concerned. I don't know how many people out here know that the entire grand jury process, which is led by the prosecutor's office, um, is a secret process. The transcripts are not available. You don't know what is being presented, and the grand jury can only respond to the evidence that has been submitted. So when Mr. Benton said that it is up to the lead detective as to what information is submitted, he is absolutely correct. And it is unfortunate that we don't find out what information is presented or even turned over to the prosecutor until after that whole process is over with, and you can request a records request at that time. By that time, it's too late in many instances, and that should not be. And for me, historically, when you think about the history of the police departments around this country and why they were established and how the policies have always been created to protect them, as Kimberly said, I did a TED talk because when I learned about qualified immunity and how that has continued to traumatize communities. It has continued to traumatize loved ones who find themselves in my situation now, unfortunately, in Casey Goodson's family situation, and the many, many more families here in Columbus and around this country. Because since 1975, we have had 65 officer involved shootings, and there has not been an officer indicted until last year. And that has some extra pieces to it that I won't go into at this particular time. But there has been no indictments. And so it brings into question what is being presented to the grand jury, and and how the grand jury is making those decisions. Um, so I think at this point, I would like to close with just a couple of thoughts, some food for thought for the community. Um, like I said, it is always that our loved ones are deemed suspects when the police officers or their spokespersons get on TV and are reporting it to the news or the dispatch or whatnot. It's the suspect did X, Y, and Z, and that's problematic. That's problematic for a jury pool potentially. It's problematic and harmful to the families that those individuals have now been robbed from. And these are legacies that we are talking about that have been destroyed because someone who had the power of life and death in their hand did not take the necessary steps, oftentimes not even following policy, but yet and still, because of qualified immunity, where the community cannot sue public officials, is problematic. And these are the things that need to be changed, and they need to be changed sooner than later. Or unfortunately, we will have more Henry Greens. We will have more Casey Goodsons. We will have more Edward Hayes, Deontay Bell, Tyree King. I mean, I could go on and on and on with the list of individuals. And that is just right here in our city, Columbus, Ohio. And then the families are left to put together the pieces as we don't even really have the time to grieve, because we have to lace our boots up to fight against a system that is created to protect officers, whether they are right or wrong, and oftentimes wrong when you add it all up, and we get no outside help. I'm thankful this time that there are outside eyes looking at this case, because this is something that we asked for 4.5 years ago, and it didn't happen. So I am thankful that this mother is going to get that, but my trust in what will be done, I absolutely will have to wait and see, because my trust in any of the systems is very minimal at this point, because of the experience that my family has had to go through, and the many, many families that came before me, and even the families after me. And I think I have said all that I want to say at this.
All right. Thank you so much, Adrian. I don't quite even have the words to let you know how much I appreciate you being on here and sharing your voice, sharing your story. You said something that I want to lift up before we get to some of the Q&A. So Mr. Benton, we're about to welcome you back into the space in a second so that we can get to the lots and lots of questions that have been asked. And thank you so much, family out there who are watching in Facebook Live and watching in YouTube. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. We also, just to remind us, especially as a segue to some of what Adrian said, because there's something she said that I want to lift up. The other part of this that we need to talk about is, no matter what's happening with the criminal investigation, the fact is, this is about pain and trauma as well. And no matter what happens with the investigation in any direction, there was a loss. There was a tragedy that happened in the community. And we got to figure out on behalf of the family and on our individual and collective wellness, and then as a community, how we get through this healthy. We have to figure that out. We have to figure that out, which means we have to use words like trauma and we have to use words like grief. We have to, because that's what's happening. We've got a zip codes, city, state that's experiencing horrific pain, and we don't know what to do with all of that energy. And we got to figure that out too, regardless of what happens. We have to figure that out, and we got to figure out how to be okay, how to heal together. Otherwise, we are fueling a whole bunch of things that are going to become toxic to our community, and that does not help us or our family. Yes, Adrian.
To that point, and I'm so sorry that I forgot this, but you definitely just brought back to my memory, for the organizers
Yes.
that go out on our behalf. It is so very important to at least know what we want. Because what I have seen of late has been so heartbreaking to me, to see the organizations battling against each other, to see who's going to be out front with no real skin in the game.
Yeah.
And that's not a knock to our support. I want that to be very clear. But when I see multiple bullhorns and people trying to be out front and, get people to follow their chant as opposed to this person's chant and things like that, that's not what it's about. That's not what it's about. Yes, we have to get in the streets. That's unfortunate, even in 2020, that we even still have to get in the streets. That's very unfortunate. But when you out there, remember, we go home with that emptiness still. And some of the people seem to me, and this is just to me, seem to be more worried about was they lead in that crowd. My son's name leads that crowd. Casey Goodson's name leads that crowd. And the minute that we forget that, the minute that we forget that that is why we're there, and we are pushing for the policies to be changed, you have failed us as a family. And I speak that collectively for all of the families because I've heard it, not just from myself. You have failed us as a family when you move and don't know what it is that we want. I'm sorry. Thank you.
No, there's no apology. That is perhaps the most important thing that we needed to hear, and the reason why you had to be present in this conversation. Because I think, and we've talked about this before too, that sometimes there's just so much going on that folks forgot that, like, there's a family that has to transition in and out of these spaces.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're thinking about the movement and forgetting that the movement is because of a loss.
Yeah.
And the movement doesn't make the loss go away, which is why we also have to have the conversation about trauma and healing. Grief.
My son was killed. He was killed the day after I came back from military duty. The day after. And I retired yesterday. But in my mind, constantly, when I would go to drill and have to come home, like that thought was there every time I came home on Sunday. My son was killed on Monday, constantly. And those are the kind of things that people don't realize, that we mentally have to fight.
Yeah.
In order to fight. So we need the community with us.
Yes.
And not against each other, trying to get clout.
Yes. Thank you.
I think I'm done.
No. And we're not done with you yet, right? So stay tuned. Stay tuned, because we're continuing the conversation. All right, so I'm going to bring in, Adrian, so don't go away.
Okay.
So I'm going to bring in Mr. Benton. And I'm going to bring in Bill Froelich, who has also done a lot of heavy lifting with the Greater Columbus Community Trust. And again, for those who are watching this, the convening space for this conversation is the Greater Columbus Community Trust. Thank you, Bill. Bill has been keeping track of the numerous questions that are coming up. And so I'm leaving us on the screen because I believe many of the questions, and Bill and I are going to try to toggle between what we're seeing. But Bill, if you see any pattern in some of the questions where we maybe can like condense them to saying this is one of the questions, maybe we could start there.
Well, Kim, it's hard to start. Ms. Hood, I just want to recognize that you were resonating with everyone. There are so many more comments connecting with you and thanking you for your voice and your leadership in this community than there are questions, which there are numerous. So I just want to pause and say thank you. And we're also sorry for the loss of your son. And I one day with your son before he was killed.
Yeah.
Wow. Trying to turn to questions. One question that resonated, that seems to be a theme throughout, was it was the second question that was asked in the Facebook chat. And it's, what processes can the community take when a police agency, whether it's CPD, Franklin County Sheriff's, or someone else, doesn't apply what they have committed to applying? And when they don't do it in a timely fashion, what can the community do to make sure that Columbus Police and other agencies are following through with protocol, following through with recommendations, and doing so in a timely fashion?
Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, to know what should be done is you have to know what should be done. And so oftentimes, because you're sitting on the outside, it's difficult to define where the pressure points should be in terms of as to what you should ask for, what it is you should be demanding. So I really think that the most important thing in these kinds of situations is transparency and honesty. And I think that having a level of communication with those who were involved in the charge of the investigation is probably the best protocol above and beyond anything else. Then you know you have a contact person. Well, what's going on with the investigation? Why hasn't an arrest taken place? I have a question because I've heard about this in the community. How do I follow up with that as far as your department is concerned? Why, in this instance, why is there such a conflict between the various law enforcement agencies? So again, I think it's the pressure points, as it were, is to communicate with those who should be responsible with the investigation and those who were involved in the investigation, even though they may not necessarily be in charge of it.
Well, and as a concrete follow-up on practices, one Facebook Live participant asked, why is there such a long period of time between a police-involved shooting and when the officer is questioned about that shooting?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that, except that police officers' shootings are handled differently. I mean, I don't know enough about the investigation to say, but I would venture to say that if the shoe were on the other foot, someone would have been arrested immediately. So, it would be a fallacy to suggest that there is not a distinction between how police officers are handled versus everyday citizens. Part of that may very well be related to the FOP contract that they have. I don't know. I'm just speculating at this point in time. But and there is a certain benefit of the doubt that is given to law enforcement officers that I think also adds to that delay as well. But it shouldn't be.
So to Mr. Benton's point, that is absolutely the answer as to why. It is in the FOP contract for officers to get that amount of time before they have to before their interview. And when they are finally interviewed, they are interviewed with their attorney present. That is something that we, unfortunately, I've had to learn all of this stuff the hard way, but it is absolutely in the FOP contract, because my pushback to that was, but y'all interview witnesses on the scene that were traumatized right in that moment. And the officers get to go home, process, communicate with whomever, wait 30 to 45 days, and then have legal representation when they are finally asked about the situation. It's the contract.
I mean, you only have to look at the George Floyd killing as an example. Here you have a video of an officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. He's being killed right before our very eyes. And look how long it took for there to be an arrest.
Bill, are there some other patterns and questions that we're seeing? I know there some of the questions that I'm seeing, are a pattern in them is talking about the lack of a number of law enforcement officers who are arrested, and some inquiry about like why might that be, and also a question. Another one that came up was, when will the federal U.S. attorney appoint a special prosecutor for this?
Is that for me to respond?
I didn't know if we had an answer for that, or if, and again, I'm also trying to create space to make sure we have so many questions. Just trying to show us all to where we've got curiosities in all different kinds of directions, which is why this is so important. And maybe, and then I'm saying this to you, family out there who are watching in Facebook and YouTube world, if this warrants a follow-up for us to be like, okay, let's start getting into some of the Q&A, then we can do that as well. But there are tons and tons of questions. Here's another one. Well, there's some. Bill, I want to go back to you because I know you're keeping the list. So I want to see if there's a pattern, because I don't want to just randomly pick.
No, I think specifically there seems to be a theme about the number of Black men and women killed in Columbus since 1975, and the number of indictments of police officers involved in those events. So perhaps, Mr. Benton, if you have an idea about that, or Ms. Hood as well. I'll say, just as a reminder, I think it's been widely reported in the news that the union contract is currently being renegotiated. And so perhaps sometime in the next few months, we'll have an idea of what those details are in that contract. Of course, the Citizen Review Board that was voted on in November will likely be one negotiating component of that contract. Of course, it was approved in the election and now has to be incorporated into the union contract. But perhaps the number of indictments versus the number of police involved events. Mr. Benton, do you have a reaction to that?
Well, a couple of things. In regards to what decisions were made in individual cases, I obviously am not in a position to address that because I don't know the details. But I certainly understand the concerns. The process itself is problematic because when you have a police officer involved shooting, those cases are presented by the Franklin County prosecutor to the grand jury, which, as Ms. Hood spoke about earlier, is a secret process. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, a lot of debate about it. So it is a process that is unique to officers, and it would be my guess, my suspicion, that an officer going in there is going to receive the benefit of the doubt. The grand jury process, while it is designed to involve citizens in the determination of probable cause, is very much a process that's controlled by the prosecutor. The prosecutor will make a suggestion as to what they believe to be the appropriate charges, and the grand jury will say, well, if that's what you want, that's what you get. The old adage from the criminal defense bar is that you can indict a ham sandwich in that same process. So I would suspect that it is a process that's very much favorable as far as law enforcement officers are concerned. As to whether or not a special prosecutor is going to be appointed, I do know, by the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's my understanding that the U.S. Attorney, Mr. DeVillis, is participating in this, so I would think he would be a better person to respond to that.
One of the questions that's coming up. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Adrian.
No, I just wanted to make the community aware. One, to remember that we've had the same prosecutor for the last 20 plus years, I think. Thankfully, he was elected out this time. But in doing some research with my son's case and everything, one of the things that stood out to me was an article that I came across where Ron O'Brien was quoted. He actually said in the article that he didn't believe that his officers did anything wrong. And that was an article from January of 2015. And when I came across that article, obviously it was very disturbing to me, because this is the person that's going to go in and present these cases. And no one has access to how that information is presented. I know one of the witnesses in my son's case, they started out asking him questions about his prison sentence, as if that was of some type of relevance to what they were there for. So, that character assassination that goes on, and, coupled with the fact that he doesn't feel that his officers did anything wrong, is all problematic to a secret process. And I want the community to remember that it's a secret process.
Thank you for that. Another thing, and this has come up in a few more questions, so I'm consolidating this a little bit. But one of the things that has come up is asking about drug testing and drug screening for officers. One person even mentioned that, the victim gets a drug screen.
Yes.
But what about the officers? So
Yes.
what do we need to know, Mr. Benton, or whoever might respond to this, about how drug screenings work for officers?
I know that as part of their interviewing process or their employment process. Beyond that, I don't know that it becomes an issue. So I don't know that there's a protocol or process that would automatically request or mandate that an officer be tested for drugs or alcohol, unless there's some factors that would suggest that that's relevant to the investigation. So, if you have a shooting and there's the officer has an odor of alcoholic beverage about his breath, I imagine that would certainly trigger that concern. But across the board, as a general protocol, I don't believe that there is one.
Well, that is definitely something that I have been talking to our state legislators about, because it doesn't only need to be applied here in Columbus. I think that it needs to be applied across the state. And if I had my way, it would be applied across the country. Unfortunately, oftentimes officers are prior military, and being that I have, that experience, I know that, even steroid use can cause aggression, right? And so it's something that I feel is necessary. We want to know what's in the quote unquote suspect system. Why don't we know what is in the officer system? So that is something that I am actively pursuing. And for those that are, on this live, reach out to your state legislators to request that be introduced into legislation, because I think that again is something that is way overdue.
Well, Ms. Hood and Mr. Benton, thank you both again so much. I'm going to put in the YouTube chat, and one of my colleagues will put into the Facebook live stream the link to the current FOP contract, just so you have access to it. It is a public document. It's on a public website. So if you want to read the contract, it's probably over 100 pages. You'll have access to it. So thank you both for this engaging conversation. and being with us here tonight. Kim, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Bill. So thank you, Mr. Benton. Thank you, Adrian. I may pull you back in, Adrian. I'm not sure. We'll see what happens, friends. Okay, so there was something that you said, Adrian, before we transition to the next part that I wanted to lift back up as we transition to the other part that's super, super significant for this. And that is, you said, and I want to make sure that we heard this. So for those of you who maybe just tuned in late, or you're just recapping because our heads are in 1,000 different places, you said something that I think must be lifted up. And that is one of the things that I think it's easy for us who are not directly experiencing it to forget is that when there is when there is a criminal investigation on a person and law enforcement and a killing, the family doesn't even barely get to grieve. Your grieving gets interrupted because you immediately get thrown into legal processes, movements and marches and protests and come here and speak, and you're pulled in 1,000 different directions, and everyone wants to know a piece of information, and then you become the poster child for all kinds of things, and it removes your ability to sit still and just feel what you need to feel, which is wrong.
Yeah.
And so I just want to take a second to just apologize to you. I'm sorry that we don't handle that the right way. I am sorry that you don't get a chance to sit still and feel and just get loved on, and that the families don't just get loved on because, like I said, no matter what happens in a case, there's a loss. And we should be showing up for you as a human being, not as a story in the movement, because it's more than that for you. So please keep us honest. Not that it's your responsibility to do so, but whenever or wherever we can do a better job of being kept honest, to remember that this is more than a case, that these are families and human beings who want to do that. So I just want to first say sorry for how we don't always think about that. And I want to say thank you for what you sacrifice in your own healing process to make sure that the community heals.
Yeah.
It's a huge sacrifice. And we're not really always worthy of what you give up. So to you, to the Goodson family, to the many other families, to the names that we need to consistently say, thank you for what you sacrifice. We appreciate you. We see you and we love you.
And I love you back. And I appreciate you saying that. It's funny because I was just having a conversation with my girlfriend, I think on yesterday actually. And I kind of used the analogy of the whole slave block. You get up and there's bids, and things like that. So you're on display.
Yes.
Right. And the reason why I equated it to the slave block piece was because of the history of policing in this country, but it's still a responsibility of mine. People keep saying they want justice for so-and-so, justice for so-and-so, right? We won't get justice because you can't give me my child back. But what you can do is hold people accountable. We can push for accountability. And that's why I'm going to stay here. And I'm not going anywhere. But I thank you for teaching me and reminding me constantly to breathe and to feel. Because I didn't get that opportunity. Because another thing that people don't know is that families in this situation, we have 2 years from the date of incident to file any legal filings that we're going to do. Just 2 short years. So you have a mother that is in complete shock for 6 months, a year and a half, whatever. 2 years is what we get to say, I'm going to fight. And sometimes mothers aren't mentally able to do that. 2 years.
Thank you for that. So here's what we're going to do, because this brings up another point. It's like there's the facts and then there's the feelings part, and they're both present. I'm bringing in Marion Stuckey, who's representing the CARE Coalition, and I'm bringing in Ariana Gallagher, who's representing the STAR program. And Adrian and I are going to fall away for a second, and we're going to let Ariana and Marion talk with us so that we understand community. There's a whole bunch going on. And some of us are responding to this out of trauma. And we don't always know what to do with all the energy we feel from the heaviness of the moment. So I'm grateful to have Ariana and Marion here to help inform us on what's really going on about what we're feeling, what the families are feeling, so that we can be more compassionately supportive of what folks really need, of what we need, so we can be at our best when sometimes the most radical thing we can do is just sit with somebody in their pain. How do we do that? So if you could help us through that, that would be amazing. And when we get to the slides, just let me know. I'll be back here.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you to the Columbus Community Trust for this opportunity to discuss community grief and trauma, especially during such a difficult time of loss. And I'd also like to say thank you, Ms. Hood, for sharing and all that you do. So my name is Marion Stuckey. I serve as a lead for the Columbus Care Coalition, and I'll let Ariana introduce herself as well.
Sure. My name is Ariana Gallagher. I'm the Associate Director of the STAR Trauma Recovery Center at OSU.
Kim, we're ready for the slides. I don't see them on my screen, but.
Here they come.
Thank you so much. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, please.
Uh-oh.
No problem. So what we-
I'm about to pull up the slides. What I have to do is I have to do something in the studio. So just bear with me 1 second and your slides will be up shortly. I can't see them, so I got to make sure I can see them.
Okay.
All right, hold on 1 second.
So while we work through that, we definitely wanted to be sure to offer our condolences to the family, to Casey Goodson Jr.'s family, and just let his family know that you're definitely in our thoughts and prayers during this time. During our presentation, we do have some mental health professionals that are available in the chat. April and Deborah are here to answer questions or to be a support if that's needed throughout today. Thanks, Kim. And we're ready for the next, actually 2 slides, please. Thank you. So just a really brief introduction. The Columbus Care Coalition is a partnership of organizations. We work really hard to recognize and respond to trauma in the community, and recognizing that there is so much hurt and pain in so many various forms that takes place in the community each and every day. But there are resources for healing and support that are available. Any loss of life is painful. It leaves many in mourning. And the foundation that we strive to always uplift at the coalition is that we're all connected in our humanity. And so the saying, when trauma happens to one, it happens to all of us, is really how we uplift that. And so our frame for the presentation today is to normalize and provide information on trauma and loss and grief in the aftermath of tragedy and how it impacts our entire community overall. Next slide, please.
I think the first thing we wanted to really highlight and elevate is kind of putting a frame around grief. Grief both for individuals and for communities. And so to do that, I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about what grief is. And it really is a natural response to experiencing loss. It's a process, and it's not a linear one. It doesn't just go in a straight line. It's really tangled up, and sometimes we feel like we're moving forward, and then sometimes we feel like we're moving back, and sometimes we feel dizzy because we've been going around in circles. But it really is that process of coming to terms with the absence of someone or something that holds a great deal of importance to us. It's that process of moving through our emotions. And when I say move through, I really do mean that intentionally, that a lot of us, because it's painful, want to skip over some of the feelings that are uncomfortable or unpleasant. But really the only way through is through. We can't go around it. We got to feel it. And it's a time of reflection and reorientation, because life is different now in the aftermath of that loss. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit too about all of the things that might be lost. Certainly we're talking in this case about loss of a loved one, but that also comes along with a lot of other kinds of loss. So we're talking about loss of a sense of safety after a trauma experience. Sometimes it represents loss of hope or a loss of feeling of being valued in our community. Sometimes we experience a loss of being recognized or honored within society. For some of us, it's loss of a dream or a sense of identity, expectations, trust. I think we've heard a bit about that experience of loss of trust, and a loss of a sense of control sometimes as well. So in addition to just grieving the loss of that person, there's a lot of other things that get tied up in this experience. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about some common reactions to grief, some of those emotions that may be a little bit difficult to manage or to sort through or to understand sometimes. For a lot of people, grief brings a sense of shock or disbelief, and certainly initially for a lot of people, there's that sense of, it can't believe that this happened. A lot of people feel numb or have a hard time connecting with their emotions initially. For many, many people, the emotional aspect of grief comes a little bit later in terms of being able to connect to those feelings. Sometimes it's hard to really believe that the loss really happened. A lot of people discuss things like reaching for the phone to call that person or text that person and then having to remember all over again, oh, they're not going to be able to respond. For a lot of people, loss also brings on sadness and feelings of emptiness or despair or yearning, some deep loneliness. And for many people, the outward expression of that might be to have some crying spells. Many people experience feelings of guilt, regret about things you did or didn't do or say that you woulda, coulda, shoulda, wish you would have done. Some people experience what we call survivor guilt, that idea that why am I still here and that other person's gone? Or a guilt from not experiencing sadness. Not everybody is going to feel that emotion, especially not at first. And so if you can't tap into that feeling, sometimes that can bring on some guilt. Anger, which we're going to talk more about here in a moment, is a very common reaction to grief and a righteous one. Honestly, anger is one of the more powerful and important emotions to really experience and make sense of. And I'm going to let Marianne talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Many of us experience fear in response to grief, worry about the future, what it might look like, feelings of anxiety or helplessness, especially when there's a legal process involved that we don't have total control over, which we're talking a lot about today. And along with all of this, it can be really physically uncomfortable to experience grief. Many of us are going to feel extra tired, fatigue, even nauseous. We may get sick more often, have a decreased immunity. to illness. We may notice changes in our weight, aches and pains, have a hard time sleeping. So in addition to all of that emotional weight that we're trying to sift through, those physical experiences can also be incredibly uncomfortable. Next slide, please.
So Ariana mentioned that anger is definitely a huge part of the grieving process. And so many of us are familiar with the stages of grief. And while it applies in some situations, it doesn't apply in all. But often anger is a very pivotal emotion that we experience. So part of grieving is definitely anger. And it's not good or bad, right or wrong. It's just a human emotion that we feel after a loss. And so what we do with our anger is really the most important to monitor. How it shows up, how it's manifesting, things we need to really be careful of, and also the intensity. So some days we might feel just a mild irritation, and then some days it can turn into just an all-out rage. And so what's really important to keep in mind is that no one can tell us how to feel. No one can tell us how to express our anger or our grief. For those who are not necessarily closely affiliated, need to kind of just be in a space where they can just kind of provide a safe space for healing and for expression. Those are some of the primary tasks that we need to make sure that we're keeping in mind, especially in situations where there are the components of not being seen as valuable or are human as a group of people. So it's expected that we're gonna feel some senses of anger in this process. Next slide, please. So anger is definitely a pivotal emotion in the sense that it helps us recognize that something is not okay. And so it helps us stay motivated for change, saying no to things that are unacceptable overall. So thinking about, again, anger as an emotion that helps push us, it serves a purpose, it serves a role. Where we have to be careful with anger is setting healthy boundaries and knowing ourselves enough to know when maybe we need to take a break, or when that anger transforms into being overwhelmed or even starts to look like depression. Next slide, please. And so next, I want to talk a little bit about traumatic loss. And so we'll talk more about trauma and what that means. But in a general sense, trauma is when a situation really overwhelms our ability to cope. And so that definitely can be a part of the grief process. And in general, when a death is without warning, it's untimely, there's violence, it's considered unfair or unjust, it really has the likelihood to feel traumatic. And so it's especially important that we think about how violence by the state adds additional layers of trauma, no matter what, when it's experienced. Next slide, please.
So some of the things to consider when we're discussing this concept of traumatic grief or traumatic bereavement, some of the types of circumstances that may lend itself to more of a trauma response to grief. If you personally witnessed the death, or if you had your own life threatened, having more than one experience with traumatic loss can certainly complicate the grief process. If there's media attention, certainly that makes things far more complicated. If there are prolonged court proceedings, it's really hard to progress through your own emotions, as we're hearing, when you're caught up in the legal process. And if the crime or the death is unsolved, that can also certainly complicate things. Next slide, please. So what happens when you're reacting to trauma? What are some common trauma responses? Most of us have heard of that fight or flight response, that idea that we're either gonna face this and stare it down, or we might avoid, isolate, run away. Freeze is another really common trauma response where it's really difficult to even know what to do next. Some folks feel paralyzed. The last response that we want to talk about is fawn, or sometimes I like to call it fold, like you're folding a hand of cards. That's when we give up our agency. We start to behave in ways that are very passive or defer to others, it's really difficult to assert ourselves sometimes when we're experiencing a trauma response. In the middle of a crisis, we don't have full access to our brain power. We are set, all of our resources are funneled into just surviving. So we don't always have full capacity to make complex decisions in those moments. And if we are working through trauma in a prolonged way, if the trauma is ongoing, that equals what we call toxic stress. And it's this constant state of activation. And no wonder we feel so exhausted and depleted. Next slide, please.
So this slide just helps us to see some of the clinical components of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is commonly diagnosed when people are, fighting wars or different things like that. People often have that point of reference, but it's really time to consider how PTSD affects us in our day-to-day lives as well. And so just thinking about some of the symptoms here, like hypervigilance, kind of always being fidgety or worried that something is going to happen, anger and irritation, having nightmares, flashbacks. The lack of hope is really important as well. And what I'd like you to just recognize here is as we think about individual and community as well as racial trauma, some of the symptoms are all in alignment with each other. The inability to feel safe anymore, fear that we're living in an unsafe world, that isolation, numbness to violence. Again, we see fear again at the far end. And when we're referring to racial trauma, it's just the emotional and psychological toll of experiences of racism. And so these are all the different, again, emotional reactions. Under racial trauma, you'll see the generational aspect. So we're talking about the cumulative effect of exposure to trauma over generations and generations, as well as experiences that are small or large in nature. So microaggressions all the way to direct face-to-face experiences of racism. Next slide, please.
So when we're talking about all of this, it can be kind of overwhelming. And if some of the folks on viewing this live are saying, check, 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 yeah, I'm experiencing all of those things. One of the things we want to make sure we convey is that it is possible to cope. And it's really important as we begin that healing process to give yourself permission to feel that range of emotions without judging yourself, and to allow other people space to be perhaps in a different place than you are, and to experience and express and process their emotions without judgment. That we can all be where we are and be on our own timeline for moving through these feelings. It can be really powerful and meaningful to find some creative ways to acknowledge the loss and to say goodbye. And that process may be ongoing. It may be something that happens on a regular basis, on an annual basis, around certain anniversaries or occasions. But finding some creative ways to honor the person and their life and what they meant to you and what they continue to mean to you can be very powerful and important. Tending to those physical needs is also really important, especially in the early stages of grief. It's really common for folks to forget to do really important things like eat or sleep. And those are the really basic core biological physical needs that we've got to really pay attention to as we're working through this process. Allow other people to support you. We don't do this alone. We don't heal by ourselves. It really does take a community of support to work through this grieving process. Be kind and patient with yourself. Sometimes you're going to be really sick of sitting in your own grief, and being able to recognize that this is frustrating, but you can be patient with yourself, and on those days, be extra compassionate with yourself. Take extra care. And plan ahead for what we call grief triggers, those things that maybe we might anticipate being a little bit harder days or harder events or anniversaries or markers, and have a coping plan. You know, who do you need in your circle on that day to be able to touch base with? Who do you need to be able to say, I need to vent, or I need to step away, or can somebody just bring me dinner, or whatever it is. So planning ahead for those grief triggers and how you want to cope with that and who you want to bring into the circle to help you through that is going to be really important. Next slide, please. When we're talking about healing, I mentioned community, and community healing means having some collective grief experiences, being open to participating with others to honor the life of the person that was lost. So that can take the form of vigils or virtual healing opportunities, debriefings. The CARE Coalition has an annual remembrance vigil for family members who lost someone to homicide. Healing happens within those relationships. And it's going to be important, even if you want to be alone, if you want to isolate, it may be even more important to have at least one or two people that you're willing to connect with. It's also really important to be open to getting some outside support. There's absolutely no shame, and it takes actually a lot of strength and courage to reach out to say, I need some extra support here to be able to work through that healing process, perhaps even with a mental health professional. Next slide, please.
So we also wanted to uplift several just thoughts around healing. And so the acknowledgement is really crucial. So we have to make sure we're acknowledging the trauma within ourselves and how it shows up, as well as within communities and families. So just keep in mind, again, we mentioned the losses are cumulative, they're adding up. And so this has been experienced over years and years and currently. So just thinking about all the load and how much that weighs on a person. Also, it's really important that we have the opportunity to verbalize and speak our truth, and just really giving voice to how we feel. I would also say making sure we have great self-care in place, or even some self-care, not even always great, but some self-care in place to make sure that we have those things in line to take care of ourselves. And we think about that ahead of time, especially during times where there's a high emotional load. And I would also say just uplifting empowerment and advocacy as two other crucial things to promote change, positive change. Next slide, please. And so there's another few things we wanted to add. And with these points, just thinking about like emergency self-care. So just really making sure that we're taking time in the moment to notice how we feel, to notice our body sensations. And so that's how really we kind of stop the cycle of trauma. Trauma reactions are instantaneous and we don't have control of them. So our body and our brains are reacting. It's up to us to just try to be aware of and try to create a little bit of space between our response. And that happens by paying attention and really noticing those sensations. When you're not feeling good, you have stomach sensations, or, you know, wherever you tend to feel your emotions, just really paying attention to that. Allowing rest to be a part of the process. I think Kim mentioned this, but rest is a vital part of the process, and knowing when you just need a moment to not be involved, to just tap out for a little bit. And also just, again, I can't say this enough, just continually monitoring ourselves and each other to make sure that we're really we're okay in the process. Next slide, please. So this is something that I often say, and grief and pain must be witnessed to be healed. And what this means is that healing happens when we can acknowledge pain and it can be held collectively. So basically the tenderness of our pain and the task of grief need to be carried out. And it's basically that going through grief is the only thing that heals grief. There's no shortcuts, right? We have to go through it to heal it. And so it has many twists and turns, and it's going to look very different for different people. It's very unique. It's not so much about lessening the grief in others as much as it is about being fully present with the magnitude of the loss that's at hand. And just also recognizing that it's okay to not be okay sometimes. I would say from a community lens, through the work of CARE, we've seen the power of community coming together time and time again, especially in times of grief and loss. And so we really want to uplift the power of just kind of bearing witness to and holding people's pain, and it just being able to speak to it and to just acknowledge it is really vital in the healing process. Next slide, please. So I know we are short on time here, so I want to get through the next couple slides relatively quickly, but we put together some thoughts on ideas for individuals, families, and communities as it comes to healing. And you'll notice that under the individual piece, we recognize that it's really important to be asking yourself these questions. What is it that I need in this moment? What am I giving myself permission to really feel right now? And then also following up with things like affirmations, grounding, journaling, breath work is important. There are several online resources for meditations. There's a Black Lives Matter meditation that can be found online. There's journal prompts. An organization named Beam is an excellent one just to be able to really process through some of our feelings. Families, thinking about collective storytelling and expression. We know talk therapy is not necessarily for everyone, but there are lots of other ways to process through what we're feeling. Time in nature, but also thinking about that there's others that are watching us and modeling healing. It's okay to cry, but also knowing that it's okay to heal as well. And then I would also advocate for just radical healing principles and advocating, as well as just embarking in collective opportunities for healing and education. And just as we're doing today, just kind of learning more information about what trauma and grief looks like and how it shows up within yourself, your family, and within the community. Next slide, please. So CARE definitely does offer resources and referrals to support and therapy. So if that's something that we can be supportive with, we're always here for that. We have a Clinicians of Color directory. We know it's really important that your support person looks like you. And so being able to have clinicians of color who are on deck and able to take referrals. We have networks and folks that are willing and ready to support the community, but also uplifting that there is the inherent strength and resilience within the community. And again, this is something that we see all the time, just based on all that has transpired. There's still that sense of wanting to be helpful and wanting to support each other. And also just really prioritizing that agency for support, that personal agency to support change. And I'd also like to uplift, we do have a virtual space on Mondays for anyone who's interested in talking more about racial trauma. Next slide, please. So we have this number here for you to call if you have any needs, but we also just wanted to close on a hopeful note and just know that hope is being able to see that there's light despite all of the darkness. And again, just really focusing and centering on the needs and the wishes and the hopes of those who are directly in pain. And again, we've seen this happening so much lately. There's so much wisdom and healing in our community. And so we all have a role to continue to support and to care and to provide to provide the opportunity for resilience as a whole in the community. So we thank you so much for this opportunity.
All right. Thank you so much to Marion and to Ariana for giving us that information. And I know some of you might be out there saying, well, I thought we were going to be talking about, well, the information is important. And remember, especially this is why we also had Adrian's voice in here. Regardless of what happens with the case, a trauma happened. Regardless of whatever happens, we still have to heal individually and collectively and in community. We have to figure out how to get through this. And one of the things Adrian said, which is why I wanted to lift it up, is remember when Adrian was speaking on behalf of the family, we don't even give them a moment to breathe, right? We don't even give them a moment. And then some of us get so desirous to go do something in the community to enact change. We're not processing our own grief either, right? And you mentioned a word in there that I wanted to lift up because I think there are sometimes some of us who are acting on this, we don't even realize it, particularly those who are feeling ourselves based on change. Like I want to do change. And we might be feeding it based on rage. And you mentioned something about emotions. And I want to mention that how many emotions we skip over before we get to rage. Hurt, depression, frustration, disappointment. There's so many things that we miss, that we don't get to address. Our own healing. Many of us who want to do work in community, we're fueling that based on some other hurts that we had that we didn't get fixed, and we didn't do our own repair work. And sometimes we're running on empty. And again, if we remember Adrian's story, sometimes what they need is love, right? And did we forget to do the love part when we're doing all of the other things? And that requires our reservoirs to be full, because if we're empty, we have nothing to give. So just as we need to understand the legalities of things so that we can make sure we are informed in our advocacy work, we also want to make sure that we are informed in how to take care of ourselves, because you can't fight the revolution 24 hours a day. You still have to sleep, you still have to use the bathroom, you still got to eat food. You should have a community of people that you're in fellowship with, and that requires us to be healthy. We're working toward the process of being healthy, healed, and whole. So, Marianne, Ariana, thank you so much. I want to bring back momentarily Mr. Benton and Bill. I'm bring you back in because there was a question that I think tied this together really nicely. So, Bill, could you share what that question was? Maybe we could get that addressed as we get ready to wrap up our program for today.
Sure, Kim. I just wanted one of our participants who fell off just came back on. Did we want to bring him in for a minute as well? And you're on mute, Kim.
Trying to be a good participant. Mr. DeVillers, are you there? If so, could you would you mind coming back on screen? Awesome. Thank you. If you could just introduce yourself so that our family who's watching out there in Facebook world and YouTube world knows who you are. And then Bill, if you could share the question.
Sure. My name is Dave DeVillers. I'm the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio.
Well, I'm going to ask two questions, and so we can incorporate everyone on the screen into the conversation. But the first question is for Mary and Ariana and Fred. We know one participant asked about community PTSD. It's a shared experience. How should the police and the community consider the re-traumatization of the community, as well as survivors like Miss Hood in the work that they're doing? That's first. And then second, for Mr. DeVillers, a longer question. First of all, we're delighted that you could join us as we're wrapping up here. But one participant asked when you might appoint a special prosecutor. Ms. Hood mentioned that the county prosecutor's office is in a state of transition, and that your office, we know, is working with the FBI, the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, and others. We also know that other investigative organizations are backing away, and we know that you can't talk about specifics of what's taking place in an investigation. So there are a ton of moving pieces, but maybe you might share with the community that's on right now where your office is in the process and what steps you're taking place in this process.
So I don't know if we want to handle the trauma question first or the question to Mr. DeVillers first.
Probably the trauma question, just to connect back, and then the question to Mr. DeVillers. But I'll go on mute.
Thank you.
I'm not quite sure that I have an answer for that question, keeping in mind that from my perspective as a defense lawyer, I represent individuals who are accused of crimes. And so on the other side of the equation are individuals who have, for all intents and purposes, been victimized. I do know that within our criminal justice system, and there have been certain changes in the law that talks about victims' rights, where they're entitled to representatives and a network of support services in addressing the trauma that they're speaking to. And certainly in dealing with clients, there are oftentimes mental health issues that are related to there as well. I can say this, and I've always maintained that whenever a crime takes place, and I'll be more specific, a homicide takes place, you have victims on both sides of the equation, because the victim's family certainly has suffered a loss, and they will continue to suffer loss. And on behalf, on behalf of the accused, their family also suffers a loss when they end up in prison. So when they go to prison, the whole family goes to prison. When an individual is killed, their whole family feels the pain of that death. One of the things that I it's not always possible to do, but one of the things that I found is when we're dealing with a point in time in which there's a sentencing, whether it be by a conviction or by way of a plea, I oftentimes look for opportunities to reach out to the family, to let them know that their loss is certainly acknowledged, that, and even though we have a job that we must do, we don't do so with any sense of callousness or indifference to the fact that they have suffered a loss. I remember one situation in particular that was extremely powerful, where there was a double homicide, and I represented an individual, and that double homicide involved on both sides of the family. It was a father who killed his wife, and the grandmother was left with the responsibility of raising not only the children from that situation, but her son was also shot and killed in that same experience. So she raised a poignant question that at some point in time in her life, she's going to have to explain to her one son why it was that the other son's father shot and killed her son. And so those are the very real contexts within which we see these experiences beyond the legal processes that certainly come into play. So again, while I don't have a more broader answer, I can only speak of it in terms of the particular situations that I've been involved with. And again, not that it's always possible, not that it's always practical, but we certainly try to make it very clear that we acknowledge the grief and the loss suffered by the family.
Yeah, I think just to quickly piggyback on that concept, I think there are a lot of process improvements that could be made in terms of the legal system as it relates to community trauma and how to minimize that impact. But as we're waiting for some of those changes to take place and we're advocating and pushing for those changes, I think really the key element that we've got to keep top of mind is behaving with compassion and remembering that these are real lives and real families that have been impacted. So I think that's perhaps what I would say to sum up.
Marion, I didn't know if you had any additional thoughts.
I actually just would totally echo what Ariana just shared. I was just going to say, just again, continued sensitivity to the ongoing complex and cumulative trauma that's happening, and just making sure there's connection to resources that are there to support as much as possible.
Thank you so much. And Bill, I'm going to go ahead and transition back to you for our last question to Mr. DeVillers, and then we'll get ready to wrap up.
Sure. I'll just repeat it quickly. One of the participants asked when you might appoint a special prosecutor. Ms. Hood mentioned that there's a transition in the county prosecutor's office presently, and your office is now working with the FBI, with the DOJ Office of Civil Rights, and others, I'm sure. Other investigative organizations are now backing away. And needless to say, there are a lot of moving pieces involved in the ongoing process. We know you can't talk about specifics, but can you tell us about what your office's role is in this process and where you are in that process?
So I know it took a while to get here, a few days to get here, but the bottom line, there's only one investigation going. It's a criminal civil rights investigation through our office. That is the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Ohio. It involves both Columbus Police Department and the FBI working together. There's no parallel investigation, which I've heard that's not the case. It's one investigation. It has our office, an AUSA, and AUSAs from our office, as well as a prosecutor from Maine Justice, that is the Civil Rights Division. And it also now has an assistant prosecuting attorney, Franklin County prosecuting attorney, and his name is Jason Manning, who's a fine prosecuting attorney. He's also cross-designated to our office. I've had conversations with both Ron O'Brien and the transition team for Gary Tyak, and they have allowed Jason to be on our team. And the plan is this: we're going to investigate this case, and if it merits being presented to grand jury, it merits prosecution, we will indict it. Where it gets indicted, we don't care if it merits an indictment, if it merits a federal civil rights violation indictment, then we will indict it here. If we think that the evidence and the law and the jury instruction is better in state, we will indict it in state court. That is that my people, that is the assistant U.S. attorneys, will try that in state court. If it is going to be in federal court, then the Franklin County assistant prosecutor will try it with us in federal court.
That's really valuable information for everyone who's on the conversation now and will take a look at it in the future. Kim, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you so much, Bill, for your assistance with the Q&A. I know we had lots of questions. We apologize if there were any questions we didn't get to. Thank you, Mr. DeVillers, for being able to join us this evening. We really appreciate your feedback and your insight. We are going to get ready to wrap up this evening. Please forgive us if we take a few extra minutes, but we want to make sure that we stay present about the huge platform this is sitting on, about all the different mantles of heaviness, right? There's the legal aspect, there's the family aspect, there's the community aspect. And so we thought it might make sense for us to also wrap up with one of our other voices who is from the Greater Columbus Community Trust. So I want to bring it to this space right now to give us some final thoughts about where we might leave this conversation before we get to whatever is the next right thing for us to do as individuals, as community. So I would like to bring in Reverend Dick Burnett to give us some final thoughts. You're muted, Reverend Burnett.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim, and thank you to all of the participants tonight. Ms. Hood, I want to say a special hello to you. We met together some months ago at the Human Library gathering at King Center, and that was life-marking moment for me. So it's good to see you again, to hear you again. Thank you for your courage. I think that we all want to say the names. We want to say Casey Goodson Jr. We want to say the name of his brave mother, Tamla Payne, who spoke yesterday at a rally that gathered some 1,500 to 2,000 people. I don't know what the press recorded, but I was there, and it seemed like an awful lot of people on the west side of the State House. But the reality is there's a lot of this city and there's a lot of our communities that frankly just sort of hear this vaguely and move on in life. I'm struck by two nearly banner headlines, major headlines in last week's Columbus Dispatch on Thursday. Goodson's mother demands justice above the fold. And then the next day on Friday, Goodson's mother calls for peace and justice. We've been talking about the trauma that all of the mothers and all of the families and communities that are associated feel, for sure. We've also been talking about the policies and the arrangements that we have in a civil society with due process of law. But as a pastor who's located in the heart of the city on the corner of 3rd and Broad on Capitol Square, I'm aware that there's a lot of the world that just passes by, and this may last in a lot of people's minds, but it may pass by. And I think the work of Greater Columbus Community Trust is to hold the frame, if you will, for a while. The way we hold the frame is to remind ourselves of the things that we already know, both in terms of civil society and due process, and also what we already know in terms of care for grief and trauma that was expressed by our colleagues from the CARE Coalition and from STAR. Terribly important work, and we're grateful for that. But I also think that we need to make a distinction between policy setting and some of the moral and ethical foundations that are underneath the policies that we have. And here I want to take a word, as I said in a meeting of the Greater Columbus Community Trust the other day. I want to take a line from the Gospel according to Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. of Princeton University. Dr. Glaude is on television a good bit, and he's also written most recently on James Baldwin. He is a theologian and a historian, and he's a trusted voice in our culture today. He says of himself, "I respect policy. I want policy to be developed and utilized fairly. But I am not a policy person," he says. "I rather am a person who looks at the moral and ethical foundations that set those policies." So I want to invite us tonight in these last few moments to think back a little bit on what are the foundations for the work that we were talking about. Carl Smallwood very appropriately raised the urgent need for complete, thorough, transparent, and independent examinations of cases. And we expect nothing less than that. This comes out of the idea of the polis going back to the 5th century before the Common Era in Greece. Certainly not a perfect environment of democracy by any stretch of the imagination, but up until then, really the best that had ever been tried. This is this idea of polis is where we get the words political. Interestingly, it's also basically the etymological basis for the word polite, believe it or not. And I'm afraid to say it's also through French and Middle English, it's where we get the word police. So the polis is a free, open, and consented place of discussion and decision. And the 4 prime virtues that go back to the days of Plato and Aristotle and get lived out in the polis that we are inheritors of are 4: wisdom, courage, moderation, that is to say, self-control, and justice. Wisdom, courage, moderation, justice. You don't have to be a member of a particular church or religious community to agree with that frame of polis, of political life, of a polity, of shared community. But we do have traditions that lead us into a comfort, that perhaps speak to the way we can be citizens one to another, with also a sense of a transcendent presence that guides us into an uncertain and taxing future. Jews and Christians share the tradition of the Psalms. And most people, I think, are familiar with the 23rd Psalm, where we say that we are not in want because God's care makes it so that I shall not want. Might we be able to turn that singular I to a collective, corporate we? We shall not want. We shall not want for justice. We shall not want for courage. We shall not want for wisdom in our day. It protects us from evil. It allows us to lie down in safe places. It leads us beside calm waters, and it restores our soul. In this hard time, in this time when we remember Casey, and we remember Henry, and we remember Tyree, may we be strengthened to go into an uncertain future with trust in a common heritage, but also trust in an open society that renews life and invites us into a greater participation with one another. And may we be granted a deep humility to step forward and to invite the wider community into this act of community trust.
Thank you so much, Reverend Burnett. I'm always appreciative, not just of your wise words, but how you are able to break down language in a way that gives it more meaning. So I'm so appreciative for your voice, for your role in this space. So we are going to go ahead and wrap up. We want to let you know that the desire is for this, on behalf of Greater Columbus Community Trust, to be something that we can do on a regular basis. How can we marry investigation of how structures work plus compassion? How do we marry those two? We'd like to be a convening space for that, where we can think about that. And in doing so, we're hoping to maybe start, if you are desirous of it, maybe a series, something that we'd like to approach as like trust talks, where we can investigate conversations on wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, as Reverend Burnett discussed. And then that we want to invite you to a call to action. I know some of you who have been listening to this, whether it's from an information standpoint, a legal and advocacy and activism and organizing standpoint, or whether it was from a trauma and resilience, a healing, healthy, and hold pursuit standpoint, there's something that we can do next, right? So we have to figure out for us, what is the next right thing for us to do? That's our call to action. But I want us to think about it on an individual level, right? We are not all designed the same way, which means we have unique gifts that we have been given. What we ask you to think about is, what is your unique gift? Why have you been put on the planet? And how does your unique gift, how is it able to contribute to justice and compassion, not just for the Goodson family, but for all of us in community, especially thinking about them in our hearts and our minds right now? How does your specific gift to contribute to that, right? Everyone is not necessarily called to a courtroom. Everyone is not necessarily called to protest in the streets. But what is your specific gift? What are you designed to do? And how can your talent or your gift contribute to whatever might be the movement work, right? And so in thinking about that, there are several different organizations who you might be able to connect with, who might help you figure out how you can contribute, right? So a couple of them that I want to mention. We know that I'm sure if you've been looking in the news, if you've been looking on social media platforms, you've seen, and I'm going to mention several you may have seen, and I would encourage you to contact some of these organizations to see if and or when and or how your gift might contribute to their works, right? So look into the People's Justice Project, look into the Juvenile Justice Coalition, look into leaders like Dontavius Geralds and Morgan Harper, who are doing great work in the community. Look into the CARE Coalition, the STAR program, the Black Community Ambassador Support Program, which holds support groups that are free to the public, especially for those who are Black organizers who may be experiencing their own trauma while protesting or doing the work. There's support groups for us, right? We also have the Freedom Bloc, who's doing political education and community. We have the Columbus Bar Association. We have the John Mercer Langston Bar Association. And again, we have the Greater Columbus Community Trust. We'll also list these things, so I'll try to go back later on, if you continue to pay attention to the Facebook page, to mention links to these organizations so you can find out, how can I help? How can I support? But most especially, how can we keep in mind the Goodson family, Adrian Hood's family, and making sure we're doing what they want, not what we feel we need to do for the movement. This is not about us on these specific levels. It's about the families that we decide that we want to serve. We want to use our gifts to serve. And above all, like in the movement, you can use your gift, but above all, the next right thing, the always right thing, is compassion. That is the next right thing that we can do. So I want to bring in Carl Smallwood. As we begin, we shall end with Carl Smallwood's words. Thank you for everyone on behalf of Greater Columbus Community Trust, all of our panelists and all of our contributors. Steve Francis, thank you for setting up the stage for us. Fred Benton, thank you so much for giving us some knowledge. Mr. DeVillers, thank you so much for giving us some insight on what's happening on levels beyond what we can see. Adrian Hood, I'm so grateful for your story. I love you so much. The community loves you. Reverend Burnett, thank you so much for our parting words. Marion and Ariana, we will try to make sure we're channeling people to you for resources and supports. And Carl, it's back to you.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for taking part of the task off my plate, which was to thank all of the speakers this evening who brought you the information that we hope you needed to know, needed to hear, and certainly some of it was news, I'm sure, to you with respect to what's going on with the federal investigation, and I hope helpful news, welcome news. So as we close, I simply want to add a footnote, that is that Greater Columbus Community Trust is stakeholders in this community members, faith leaders, business leaders, members of government, members of nonprofits that have a role in this community. And all of us are working together trying to work together, trying to create a space for us to come together, to listen, to work, and to make certain that we can respond to the needs this community has in ways that bring us together, not in ways that tear us apart. So thank you for making time for us. Thank you for making space for us. And as Kim said, we will be back. This was the first in a series. We will look forward to talking to you soon. Have a good evening.